On November 30th, 1943, in the basement of the Soviet embassy in Thran, Iran, Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov hesitated during his signing of the operations summary, his pen lingering above, phrasing that would stay out of all formal Soviet records. Absent the 400,000 trucks supplied by the Americans, such an assault would prove unfeasible. Our troops advance on wheels made in America. From the embassy's window, the faint roar of Studebaker motors, built by Americans, echoed from Tehran's roads, transporting Soviet materials to the gathering where Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill were set to confer. At that instant, the Soviet Union's premier military leader grappled with a reality destined to lurk in secret files for almost 5 decades. The Red Army driving the Wehrmacht toward Berlin relied on American vehicles for transport, American gasoline for power, and American rations for sustenance. Lacking this support, the Soviet Union would have suffered defeat, a point Stalin himself conceded in a discreet toast mere hours afterward. A total of 427 of the 2-4 American trucks and jeeps navigated the perilous Arctic shipments, the Persian Pathway, and the Pacific Path to reach Soviet control. This exceeded the vehicles manufactured by the Soviet Union over the whole conflict. It surpassed the truck holdings of most countries combined. These apparatuses shifted the Red Army from reliance on foot soldiers and equine transport to a motorized torrent capable of upholding campaigns over vast 1,000-mile battle lines. None of the Soviet commanders there in Thran that day could foresee that their confidential remarks on American assistance were meticulously noted, not only by U.S. transcribers, but also by their NKVD operatives, forming a hidden dossier that would challenge generations of Soviet narratives on the Great Patriotic War. The reality of Soviet logistics originated in catastrophe. On June 22, 1941, as 3.8 million Axis troops surged over the Soviet border in Operation Barbarossa, they encountered a Red Army utterly ill-equipped for motorized combat. The Soviet truck inventory, totaling around 700,000 units, mainly comprised the Gaza AA, a permitted replica of the 1930 Ford Model A, and the ZIS-5, derived from 1920s U.S. blueprints. In just 6 months, 40% of these vehicles fell to destruction or seizure. The figures exposed an industrial shortfall that Soviet messaging labored for years to conceal. During 1941, the Soviet Union manufactured only 124,176 trucks, yet suffered losses nearing 300,000. The Ghazi plant in Gorky, the country's chief truck producer, faced relocation to the east amid advancing German troops, slashing output to nearly nothing. The ZIS facility in Moscow switched to tank assembly as the Wehrmacht loomed outside the capital. By the start of 1942, whole Soviet units proceeded by Shanks Mare, with cannons dragged by horses, whenever such animals were available. The Second Shock Army, cornered in the Fokov encirclement, forfeited 95% of its conveyance in a failed escape bid. Troops hauled ammunition manually for artillery they could no longer reposition. This marked the Red Army ripe for overhaul by American assistance, even as it required 4 decades for Soviet authorities to openly recognize the change. The Wehrmacht's armored thrusts had revealed the essentials of contemporary conflict: agility, velocity, and dependable supply chains. Soviet units, for all their advantages in manpower across various sectors, repeatedly faced outflanking and isolation due to inferior German speed. Divisions of foot soldiers that warranted motorization slogged along paths. Gun crews dependent on traction vehicles turned to equines that perished in droves during the Russian cold. On October 1, 1941, at the port of Arangelsk in the Soviet Arctic, the British convoy PQ-1 unloaded amid the icy gloom of the polar fall. 20 American trucks, the initial wave of an impending deluge, rumbled ashore onto Soviet territory. To local drivers familiar with machines demanding extensive repairs per mile driven, these Chevrolets, with their protected cabins and dependable power plants, appeared as wonders. By November 1941, with the Vermichar just 12 miles from the Kremlin, U.S. trucks began flowing in at 2,000 monthly via diverse channels. The Persian route, overseen by American specialists who assumed command of Iran's national rail system, boosted throughput by 600%. The Pacific Lane, restricted to civilian goods owing to Soviet-Japanese accords, nonetheless ferried thousands of autos. The risky Arctic fleets, battered by U-boat and Luftwaffe strikes yet persistent, kept supplying vital goods. The trucks embodied a technical advance that Soviet technicians struggled to grasp. The Studebaker US-6 boasted six-wheel propulsion, powering every wheel, unlike the four-wheel setups on Soviet models with only rear drive. Its motor generated 94 horsepower, outpacing the ZIS-5's 73. Above all, the American trucks included built-in recovery winches for self-extraction. These vehicles enabled Soviet troops to extract themselves from the muck that would immobilize their own transports until the thaw. The trucks arrived outfitted with implements unfamiliar to Red Army mechanics, full sets of 128 tools, hydraulic lifts, tire-fixing gear, and illustrated spare parts lists with indexed items. In contrast, a typical Soviet lorry included only rudimentary hand implements, assuming it had any at all. The U.S. side had anticipated every detail. Features like cold start mechanisms, functional cab warmers, and waterproof wiring that resisted shorts in damp environments were standard. The Tehran Conference, spanning November 28 to December 1, 1943, yielded one of the most remarkable confessions in Soviet annals, kept secret in U.S. records until 1961 and unreleased in the USSR until 1989. At a secluded meal on November 30th, attended solely by Roosevelt, Churchill, and their inner circle, Stalin stood to propose a toast that flew in the face of decades of official Soviet rhetoric. As recounted by Charles Bolin, the president's translator, Stalin proclaimed, "I want to tell you what, from the Russian perspective, the President and the United States have done for victory in this war. The most important things in this war are the machines. The United States has proven that it can produce from 8,000 to 10,000 airplanes per month. Russia can only produce at most 3,000 airplanes a month. The United States, therefore, is a country of machines. Without the machines we received through Lend-Lease, we would have lost the war." Field Marshal Alan Brooke, head of the British Imperial General Staff, noted in his journal that Stalin had highlighted trucks particularly in the subsequent technical exchanges. The Soviet premier described the American Studebakers as the finest trucks worldwide for their circumstances and dubbed them the bedrock of Red Army maneuverability. Nevertheless, merely 3 years on, in 1946, Stalin would announce publicly that Lend-Lease aid was just marginal, amounting to roughly 10% of Soviet output. This falsehood solidified as official doctrine, upheld by censors and scholars who prioritized their positions and survival over factual integrity. Tehran documents also exposed other vital acknowledgments. Marshal Kliment Voroshilov informed U.S. supply experts, "Your trucks are winning the war for us. One American truck is worth 10 light tanks to us." Such words from a top commander who in public attributed triumph solely to domestic Soviet manufacturing. To appreciate the pivotal role of U.S. trucks, consider the raw numbers behind Soviet supply chains. An advancing Soviet infantry division demanded 450 tons of provisions each day: bullets, rations, gasoline, bandages, and more. On the defensive, that dropped to 300 tons. An armored corps needed 1,000 tons. Transporting such loads from rail depots to combat zones over the USSR's rudimentary roadways demanded reliable haulage. In 1943, Major General Andrei Krylev, overseer of Soviet rear services, assembled data that stayed under wraps until 1991. His analysis laid bare the grim figures. The Red Army needed at least 450,000 trucks for assaults. From January through September 1943, Soviet factories built only 49,000. U.S. shipments in that span reached 94,000. Lacking American rigs, Soviet units couldn't push farther than 50 kilometers from tracks. The edge in quality rivaled the sheer volume. Soviet haulers, mostly ZIS-5 and GAZ-AA models, boasted payloads of 2 to 3 tons, yet seldom hauled over 1 tons on battlefield paths before failing. The Studebaker US-6, spec'd for 2 tons, regularly managed 5 tons on paved routes and 3 tons off-road. It averaged 10,000 kilometers between breakdowns versus 2,000 kilo for Soviet counterparts. This engineering prowess went further than durability. U.S. designs incorporated advances beyond Soviet engineers' dreams. Weatherproof air brakes, lightweight aluminum cylinders, effective oil strainers, and regulators for steady engine heat. Soviet vehicles relied on brakes that locked up in rain, heavy iron pistons, ineffective sediment traps, and motors prone to freezing in winter or boiling in heat. Although Arctic shipments seized the spotlight with their fierce struggles against U-boats, the Persian Corridor emerged as the main conduit for U.S. trucks to Soviet fronts. This 4,000-mile lifeline, threading from American docks via Iran to the USSR frontier, stood as a pinnacle of wartime logistics. In mere months, U.S. specialists overhauled Iran's basic setup. They took over a lone rail line handling 200 tons a day and boosted it to 6,000 tons. They paved roads over former caravan trails. They erected desert factories capable of readying 300 trucks per day. The assembly facility in Andameshk turned into the emblem of the formidable prowess of American industry, found a new foothold in the Middle East. Soviet operators, exhausted from arduous treks originating in the Caucasus, would undergo just 3 days of instruction on U.S. equipment before piloting their fresh lorries over 1,800 miles to the battlefield. The jolt of cultural disparity hit hard. Troops from the USSR, used to machines demanding endless fixes, now controlled apparatus that functioned without fail. Come the middle of 1943, the Persian route was funneling in thousands of lorries each month. The harbor at Khorramshahr, which managed only 50,000 tons a year prior to the conflict, now managed 250,000 tons monthly. The streamlined operations of the Americans left Soviet coordinators in awe as they dispatched updates to Moscow detailing how vessels were emptied in a mere 48 hours, jobs that dragged on for 2 weeks in Soviet harbors. Overall, the shipments via this pathway tallied tens of thousands of vehicles, with projections indicating that close to half of all U.S. lorries made it to the Soviet Union through Iran. This conduit ran with such precision that Soviet supply experts examined and sought to emulate it, yet they couldn't bridge the gap without equivalent manufacturing foundations. Pairing UL lorries with Soviet multiple rocket systems birthed one of the war's most dreaded armaments. The BM-13 Katyusha launcher had first been fitted to Zayas-6 chassis, but that model's output halted in late 1941. The limited rail-based and trailer variants turned out largely ineffective for dynamic combat. The Studebaker US-6 altered the landscape entirely. Its bolstered frame withstood the fierce kickback from a complete barrage. The six-wheel propulsion enabled crews to launch, then reposition swiftly ahead of enemy reprisals. The off-road prowess of the Studebaker proved so outstanding that it earned official adoption in 1943 as the BM-13N normalized setup. By the conflict's close, more than 1,800 such adapted Studebaker platforms had been built. Units armed with them saw survival figures 400% better than those relying on domestic Soviet rigs. The capacity to unleash a volley and shift positions in under 3 minutes hinged completely on dependable transport. Soviet lorries, whenever they operated at all, required a quarter hour for the identical maneuver. The mental toll rivaled the material havoc. Wehrmacht troops dubbed them Stalin's organs. While observing, they were hauled on American frames. Shifting to U.S. bases streamlined the supply chain for Soviet rocket units. A unified guidebook, shared spares, and consistent drills supplanted the ad hoc fixes of prior phases. The numbers behind output underscore the sheer improbability of Soviet success absent U.S. lorries. USSR vehicle output across the war summed to roughly 46,100 from June 22, 1941, 32,300 in 1942, 4,600 in 1943, 57,400 in 1944, and 27,600 through May 1945. All told, Soviet lorry fabrication hit about 205,000 pieces, barely half the 427,284 supplied by America. Set against this, attrition proved devastating. Almost 300,000 lost in 1941 alone, with cumulative war losses surpassing 500,000, lacking U.S. inflows. The Soviet motor pool would have dwindled to zero by summer 1942. Each major Red Army push following Stalingrad rode on American tires. In 1945, U.S.-made vehicles formed 33% of the entire Soviet fleet, yet accounted for 70% of its hauling power thanks to greater loads and dependability. The financial angle mattered just as much. One Studebaker US-6 ran 130 to build in 1943. The Soviets got them gratis under Lend-Lease. Crafting comparable units at home would have drained roughly $800 in 1943 funds, assets urgently required for tanks and planes, along with factories the USSR just didn't have. Operation Batraton, kicking off on June 23, 1944, laid bare how U.S. lorries had reshaped Soviet maneuvers. This colossal assault, which shattered German Army Group Center and racked up 450,000 enemy losses, couldn't have happened without American mobility. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's strategy highlighted the numerical reliance. His first Belarusian front demanded 12,000 tons of provisions each day. Rail lines could stockpile points 60 to 100 kilometers from the front. Beyond that, only wheeled transport sustained momentum. Rokossovsky commanded 19,000 lorries, including 14,000 American ones. The blistering pace, 450 kilometers in 5 weeks, caught German commanders off guard, who figured Soviet troops would halt every 100 to 150 kilometers to regroup supplies. Wehrmacht scouts had gauged Red Army striking power from Soviet factory tallies alone, oblivious that U.S. additions had tripled transport muscle. Over Bagration's 5 weeks, American lorries serving the Soviets hauled 400,000 tons of ammunition. During Operation Bagration, the logistics effort was immense. The Red Army moved 1.67 million troops, supplied 300,000 tons of provisions, and relocated 250,000 injured soldiers. This operation burned through 67,000 tons of gasoline, much of which was transported via other U.S. vehicles. Even Soviet truck output for all of 1944 wouldn't have supported such an advance beyond a single week. This marked a sharp departure from prior campaigns. For instance, the unsuccessful second fight for Kharkov in May 1942 ground to a halt in part due to supply lines stretching too thin after just a few days. Come 1944, bolstered by U.S. trucks, Soviet troops sustained their push for entire weeks, transforming battlefield successes into overarching wins. Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's premier general, offered 3 distinct accounts of U.S. assistance that stayed concealed until the USSR's dissolution. These revelations chipped away at the narrative of Soviet independence in the war effort. The initial one surfaced in KGB eavesdropping records. Back in 1963, amid a casual chat at his dacha, oblivious to the bugs, Zhukov remarked, "Folks claim the Allies did nothing for us, yet it's impossible to ignore that the U.S. shipped us essentials we needed to build up reserves and keep fighting. Lacking those American trucks, we couldn't have moved our guns anywhere." The next came from discussions with author Konstantin Simonov in 1965 and 1966, captured on tapes that were buried until 1990. Zhukov spoke plainly. Absent American trucks, our artillery would have stayed put. They handled a major share of our frontline mobility. The final version turned up in Zhukov's unprinted draft, confiscated in 1969 and stored away until 1992. Reflecting on the Berlin assault, he highlighted how U.S. trucks enabled the delivery of 2.2 million shells over 2 weeks through non-stop resupply trips, feats unattainable without them. Nikita Khrushchev's covertly taped recollections, slipped out to the West in 1970, delivered the fullest acknowledgement of Soviet reliance on U.S. support. Verified later via audio forensics and cross-checked sources post-USSR, it included Khrushchev's forthright take, "Let me share my honest thoughts on Stalin's perspective regarding whether the Red Army and Soviet state could have handled Nazi Germany and endured the conflict without help from America and Britain." He cut straight to it. Without U.S. backing, victory would have eluded us. Pitted alone against the Nazis, we'd have buckled under their onslaught and been defeated. Khrushchev zeroed in on trucks too. Officially, no one mentions it, and Stalin, as far as I know, never put his thoughts in writing. But he voiced this to me more than once in private talks. Our casualties would have been staggering without any room to maneuver. Ironically, this same Khrushchev, while heading the Soviet government, proclaimed publicly that the USSR triumphed through its internal strengths alone, a glaring inconsistency that captured the regime's conflicted stance on U.S. contributions. Technicians servicing U.S. trucks grasped the chasm in vehicle tech between the two nations. U.S. motors employed lightweight aluminum pistons versus the ponderous cast-iron ones in Soviet models. American rigs came with oil filters. Soviet ones used basic sediment basins. U.S. trucks boasted enclosed wheel bearings good for 50,000 kilometers. Soviet versions barely hit 5,000 kilometers at best. The U.S. spares setup stunned Soviet repair crews. Detailed catalogs listed each component by code, so ordering meant getting the precise match. In contrast, Soviets scavenged from wrecked units or crafted replacements manually. U.S. models even incorporated safety features like shatterproof glass, dual-side mirrors, reverse lamps, and easy-grip horns, ideas Soviet engineers hadn't prioritized. Far beyond wartime utility, these American trucks reshaped Soviet approaches to vehicle production. By examining them, Soviet designers absorbed principles that shaped their truck innovations for years after the war. The ZIS-150, the USSR's inaugural large-scale post-war truck, basically reimagined U.S. concepts gleaned from the Studebakers. U.S. trucks also brought a fresh emphasis on upkeep that was alien to Soviet methods: routine checkups, organized diagnostics, uniform components. Drawn straight from U.S. examples, these practices would guide Soviet manufacturing progress for decades. The Red Army's debacle in the 1939-40 Winter War with Finland laid bare dire supply shortcomings. Struggling to equip units merely 150 kilometers from Leningrad, they lost 126 out of 875 killed and 265 to 980 hurt, facing Finns a mere tenth as numerous. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko's after-action review pinpointed vehicle deficits as pivotal. Despite outnumbering foes, Soviet units couldn't mass forces owing to haulage constraints. By 1944, U.S. trucks had rectified that vulnerability. The challenges highlighted in Finland were starkly revealed. The Red Army's assault on Finnish troops in June 1944 worked out exactly due to U.S. trucks sustaining supply routes across landscapes that had thwarted Soviet transport efforts 4 years prior. Moscow's publicity frequently asserted that rail systems, rather than lorries, formed the backbone of logistics, thereby downplaying the role of American trucks. Newly released High Command analysis explained the impracticality of this view. During their withdrawal, Nazi forces demolished 65,000 kilometers of rail lines, 13,000 bridges, and 400 depots. Soviet rail engineers managed to repair roughly 20 kilometers per day amid fighting, yet these rebuilt single-track sections could only accommodate 6 to 8 trains each day, compared to 40 to 50 on undamaged dual-track paths. Even more vital, rail networks terminated at set locations, leaving the last 50 to 100 kilometers to frontline troops dependent on trucks. Without those vehicles, no provisions reached the troops. The Wehrmacht grasped this truth to their detriment. Their skilled rail experts kept up at first, but the shortage of trucks led to stockpiles piling up idly at railheads as fighting units went without shells. Although Studebakers fired up the Soviet fascination, the broader array of U.S. vehicles held comparable significance. The 51-500 Willys Jeeps transformed scouting and leadership operations. The 69,000 Dodge 3-4-ton trucks delivered battlefield movement for foot soldiers, whereas 47,000 Chevrolet 1.5-ton rigs acted as reliable divisional haulers. Marshal Ivan Konev observed that Jeeps enabled immediate oversight of engagements, with leaders inspecting several divisions each day, speeding up decision-making and granting a crucial edge. The deliberate omission of Lend-Lease contributions started prior to the conflict's close. In February 1945, the State Defense Committee released Confidential Directive No. 75/72, mandating the removal of all images of imported gear from print. Triumph belonged solely to domestic Soviet manufacturing. This sparked a 4-decade effort to wipe U.S. trucks from the collective Soviet recollection of the war. In photos, foreign machines were airbrushed out and swapped with local ones. Movies featuring American haulers got cut or scrapped entirely. Accounts from ex-soldiers underwent scrubbing to excise mentions of outside help. This erasure reached data as well. The sanctioned 1960 Soviet Chronicle asserted that Lend-Lease accounted for just 4% of wartime output, achieved via skewed calculations that pitted U.S. shipments against overall Soviet manufacturing, including non-military items, using ruble figures that cheapened the value of American gear. When old soldiers penned recollections naming U.S. vehicles, publishers routinely swapped precise details for fuzzy phrases. Studebaker turned into truck. American rigs became our trucks. Whole sections got reworked to purge any trace of external support. As Cold War strains mounted, the cover-up grew fiercer. By 1948, Politburo figure Nikolai Voznesensky put out documents insisting Lend-Lease made up almost 4% of Soviet output, all while branding the U.S. as the head of the anti-Soviet bloc. This stance defined policy for 40 years. Soviet scholars aware of the facts confronted a stark dilemma: echo the falsehoods or endanger their livelihoods. The majority opted for security, crafting narratives that attributed success purely to homegrown industry. This twisting permeated schooling. Kids in Soviet classrooms absorbed that their country toppled Hitler with minimal outside aid. Exhibits in museums showcased seized German hardware but concealed U.S. vehicles. Monuments to the war lauded Red Army tanks, yet overlooked the trucks ferrying shells to the lines. Mikhail Gorbachev's Glasnost era at last allowed open dialogue. In 1989, the Military History Journal released transcripts from the Tehran Conference exposing Stalin's own concessions. The backlash was intense. Audiences realized their whole wartime perspective rested on fabrications. Survivors began sharing unfiltered tales. During a 1990 gathering in Moscow, ex-transport crews rose to recount their experiences with American trucks, unveiling narratives buried for 45 years. Disclosures from archives proved breathtaking. Experts uncovered parallel ledgers, accurate figures for inner use, fabricated ones for the masses. The true data indicated U.S. trucks formed 70% of Soviet hauling power by 1945. Dr. Boris Sokolov, poring over fresh declassified files, concluded without doubt that stripping away American trucks from the Soviet arsenal would doom every push after Stalingrad. The Red Army advanced on Berlin wearing American footwear and traveling in American lorries. The clash for Berlin in April and May 1945 offered the clearest proof of these trucks' value. The supply demands were immense. Some 2.5 million Soviet troops, plus 4,600 guns, needed non-stop provisions over ravaged German ground. Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front demanded 25,000 tons of goods daily on its own. Its supply chain featured 22,000 trucks, of which 16,000 were American. The shell usage, 2.5 million rounds in the opening week, demanded vehicles running non-stop shuttles. Under intense bombardment, U.S. supply vehicles typically completed 4 delivery trips each day, covering a 100-kilometer round journey. In contrast, Soviet trucks, whenever they were functional, could barely handle a single trip without failing. Even during triumphant occasions, reliance persisted. The celebratory procession through Berlin relied on American transports, the cleanest and most dependable available. Red Army troops captured the Nazi stronghold while traveling in vehicles supplied by President Roosevelt. The full extent of U.S. assistance, disclosed only after the USSR's dissolution, proved astonishing. Deliveries included 4 to 27,044 trucks and jeeps, 13 and 33 armored units, 35 170 motorcycles, 2 328 ordnance support vehicles, plus essential supplies, 7 million tons of fuel products, 40 million tons of provisions, 44 million pairs of footwear, 199 steam engines, and 11,075 rail wagons. Just the motorized assets outnumbered all German truck output for the whole conflict, sufficient to fully equip 60 infantry divisions with mobility. As the war concluded, American transports had hauled 60% of total munitions, shifted 70% of fuel supplies, rescued 65% of injured personnel, and dragged 58% of field guns. Right after the conflict, appreciative Soviet commanders floated ideas for tributes to U.S. support. Marshal Zhukov advocated a monument honoring the Allied arsenal of democracy. The ruling Communist Party dismissed every such idea. Over 45 years, no recognition marked the contribution of those American vehicles. It wasn't until 2004 that a simple Lend-Lease commemoration was dedicated in Murmansk. Controversy still arose around it. This lack of memorials highlighted a greater loss, the pilfering of collective recollection. Generations of Soviet people matured under the illusion that their country triumphed over Hitler single-handedly. With surviving eyewitnesses fading, their accounts turn into invaluable records. During a 2005 assembly in Moscow, surviving transport operators established the Studebaker Brotherhood to safeguard the authentic narrative. They gathered long-concealed images from 6 decades past, depicting U.S. machines bearing Soviet insignia. Their closing declaration, endorsed by 200 former soldiers, affirmed, "We advanced to success in American trucks. We consumed American rations. We unleashed American shells. This doesn't lessen the Soviet toll. 27 million of ours perished." Yet honesty reveres their legacy more than fabrications. Those U.S. vehicles aided in rescuing our homeland. Now, as Russia once more reshapes World War II accounts for ideological aims, the Lend-Lease tale gains fresh importance. Contemporary Russian schoolbooks downplay U.S. contributions even further than their Soviet predecessors. This fits a larger effort to bolster patriotism via invented lore. Still, the quantifiable evidence endures unaltered. The verified shipment of 427,284 American transports, over twice the USSR's wartime output of 205,000 trucks, defies erasure. Statements from Stalin, Khrushchev, and Zhukov, archived in numerous repositories, resist refutation. This reality underscores that global partnership rather than solitude overcame fascism. The U.S. trucks ferrying Soviet warriors to triumph sprang from the arsenal of a democratic system, generously provided to a partner amid clashing beliefs. Beyond mere logistics, the saga of American vehicles in Soviet hands illustrates how manufacturing prowess decides contemporary battles, how doctrines warp the past, and how facts surface despite censorship. Those 427 U.S. trucks and jeeps arriving in the Soviet Union marked the crucial divide between success and collapse on the Eastern Front. They evolved the Red Army from a railway and horse-reliant outfit reminiscent of World War I into a mobile force ready for prolonged advances over vast terrains. Soviet commanders grasped this reality. At Yalta, Stalin conceded that absent American equipment, defeat would have been inevitable. Zhukov admitted that without U.S. trucks, Red Army units lacked means to haul artillery. Khrushchev recognized that sans American backing, the USSR couldn't have resisted the Nazi onslaught. Nevertheless, for 45 years, official Soviet doctrine peddled a fabricated version. Images were altered, writings edited, data manipulated. The party robbed its citizens of their genuine triumph story, substituting myth that advanced agendas but betrayed factual integrity. It took perestroika and glasnost for the complete picture to surface from declassified files, tapes, and witness statements. The proof irrefutably showed that American trucks didn't merely bolster the Soviet campaign, they made it viable. The Studebakers, dubbed Zhodnik by troops for their versatility, go-anywhere machines, proved as vital to conquest as the revered T-34 tanks in every tribute. Concealing and then disclosing this reality offers insights extending past wartime tactics. It reveals how dictatorial systems control narratives, how agendas trump precision, and how veracity prevails over enforced silence. In the end, the irrefutable numbers stand firm. Soviet troops arrived in Berlin aboard American vehicles. The arsenal of democracy overcame the Wehrmacht not solely through weaponry, not tanks, but vehicles on wheels. A staggering 427,184 in number, they journeyed across vast seas and lands, ferrying the Red Army to ultimate success. The U.S. trucks that revolutionized the Red Army's operations went beyond simple machinery. They embodied the essence of how a democratic nation's manufacturing strength, offered without hesitation to even its philosophical rivals, became a game-changer in the worldwide battle against fascism. Soviet commanders who confessed that defeat would have been inevitable, absent those American trucks voiced a reality that rises above partisan divides. Contemporary conflicts succeed through more than sheer valor. They demand the fusion of heroism with massive production power. Ultimately, the durable Studebakers that endured for years in Soviet use outlived the falsehoods spread about them. Eyewitnesses understood it, archives confirmed it, and the annals of time affirm it. Absent those U.S. trucks, a Soviet triumph would have eluded them. The rolling stock from democracy's forge transported not only provisions, but the aspirations of entire peoples to overcome despotism. The ultimate twist lies in how U.S. largesse forged the Soviet might that for 45 years rejected any acknowledgement of American aid. Still, facts, much like those dependable U.S. motors, persist despite ideological distortions. The Soviet leaders had it correct. Defeat awaited them without 400,000 American trucks.